Welcome, everybody. If you're just signing on, let a few people get on first before we get going.
Just to let you know, we have a practice session banner showing on the screen.
Get on first before we get going. Well, hang on, let's make sure that the YouTube live stream isn't talking at the same time.
Just to let you know, we have a practice session banner.
Nope, that's over. Just letting people in. Welcome, everybody. Wait a couple minutes and then we'll get started. It's a beautiful day out there, so thank you for spending your time with us on Zoom. Wait another 30 seconds, then we'll get started. All right, I guess we'll get going. Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Losack. I'm Executive Director of the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. Welcome to everyone who's on our panel, and welcome to all of our attendees. A couple of things before I turn it over to the Chair of the Board of Directors for the Renters Alliance. This is being broadcast live on YouTube. We are recording, so we will also put it up for people to review again. There may be press on the call, and we will allow certainly questions and concerns to be raised in the chat. And myself and my fellow board member, Brandy Brooks, will monitor the chat, and we will get to questions and concerns as we go. We have two sections tonight. The first will be on the legislative issues that we faced in the Maryland General Assembly. And the second part will be on the rent subsidy program, code enforcement, and renters' rights issues and under the supervision of the Department of Housing and Community Affairs and Health and Human Services. And so we'll get to them in the second half, and then we will also have questions and answers for that. So with that, let me turn it over to the Chair of the Board for the Renters Alliance, Mr. William Roberts. William?
Well, thanks, Matt, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us on a very summery spring day. Hope folks were able to get out and enjoy some of the sunshine, but we're also able to stay cool. We welcome you in and look forward to the conversation that we're going to have tonight. I know there's lots going on, including the President's Joint Address, so appreciate you spending some time with us to talk about the critically important issues facing renters and tenants in Montgomery County and across the state of Maryland. Just a little bit about the Renters Alliance, in case you don't know. We are the only organization in the county, in Montgomery County, dedicated exclusively to education, outreach, and advocacy for tenants and for renter issues. And as folks know, that takes place in one-to-one services, trying to help individual tenants and families stay out of the eviction pipeline. We believe, and as you'll hear us talk about tonight, the best time to help folks avoid eviction is not when they are in an eviction proceeding. And so we try our best to work with the partners that you'll hear from on your screen, from the county and other nonprofit partners and other legal partners, to aid families and renters that are finding themselves in the eviction pipeline. But we also spend a lot of our time educating and advocating tenants about their rights, educating tenants themselves about their rights, but advocating for tenants before the county council and before the General Assembly, and you'll hear a lot about that this evening and the policy aspects of what's going on. As folks know, we just wrapped the Maryland General Assembly, and so we are excited to hear from our fantastic panel of guests, which will be introduced in a moment, to talk about sort of where we are, the moment in time as the General Assembly is wrapped in the midst of this still coming and yet here already eviction crisis with more waves to hit, where we fully expect about 200,000 renters across the state to potentially face eviction, and that's including 14,000 here in Montgomery County. And so we know the disruption that evictions cause to families and communities, and we certainly know the amount of folks who have been drawn into a crisis because of the pandemic, and not just the health crisis, but the economic crisis that's befallen a lot of people, so many people. And so with courts ramping up and expecting to see about 750 or so eviction cases a day, we are all concerned about the toil that this is going to take on the renter community. And so we're excited tonight to hear from a number of people. That excitement is certainly tempered with disappointment. You'll hear about some of the progress that was made during the General Assembly, but also, frankly, some of the disappointments that we as a renter community and as advocates have with what wasn't able to be accomplished or what wasn't accomplished in Annapolis. And we'll try to also figure out sort of where to go in that gulf. Where do we go post-session without all the protections intact that we were hoping to have at the end of the 90 days? And how can we as a community make sure that we're taking care of each other and tenants? So I'm looking forward to an engaging conversation with all of our panelists. I hope you are too. I want to thank our panelists for taking the time out to be with us. And before we hop in and start to introduce folks, I just want to ask my fellow board members to introduce themselves really quickly. And so we can start with Chris.
Good evening, Will, and people who have decided to attend this wonderful town hall meeting. My name is Chris Perry. I am a retired IT consultant, former Air Force officer, Vietnam vet, and I've lived in Silver Spring downtown for 12 years. I've been on the board of directors for the Renters Alliance for several years, and I'm anxious to extend our mission and the aid that we give to renters even further than we have in the past.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Sophia?
Hello. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sophia Bushin. I am a renter myself and a member of Renter Alliance Board of Directors, and I live in Silver Spring downtown. And I've been with the board for, I guess, almost a year now. So.
That's right. That's right.
Also the vice chair of the Silver Spring Citizens Advisory Board.
Yes, thank you.
That's right. We've got all the heavy hitters. Thanks, Sophia. Justin?
Good evening. My name is Justin Chappell. I've been on the board of the Renters Alliance since 2014. I live in South Silver Spring, which is one of the most dense parts of the county, and I'm on the board of our neighborhood association that has 15 buildings of apartments.
Oh, Justin, I think you might have gone on mute.
You went mute there, Justin.
No, I was done.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Justin. And Brandy?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Brandy Brooks. I use she, her pronouns, and I am also a renter living in Kensington, Wheaton. I have family members who are renters across Montgomery County. It's been a pleasure to be on the board since 2018. And I've been working as an advocate and consultant around housing and environmental justice for over 15 years.
Fantastic. Our other fellow board members you're going to hear from a little bit later in our program, Delegate Janelle Wilkins and Delegate Vaughn Stewart, who I'm going to turn it over to right now, in fact.
Thank you, Will. It's great to see everyone this evening. I'm Delegate Vaughn Stewart. I've been in the Maryland House of Delegates since 2019, and I've been on the Renters Alliance board since 2015. And in 2020, I had the privilege of serving on our next speaker's COVID-19 Access to Justice Task Force, where I was on one of the dozen or so committees. I mostly did work around debt collection, but the premise and the function of the task force was to identify obstacles to low-income Marylanders achieving economic security, particularly in the areas of housing, and also how we sort of come out of this pandemic in a way that promotes housing security, economic security, and just basic dignity for working class Marylanders. And so I was happy to serve on that, and I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, who has been an absolute champion for renters since back in his state Senate days, all the way through now to being our people's champ in Annapolis, our Attorney General. So without further ado, I give you.
Thank you very much, Vaughn. And let me say thank you to Matt and William and the Renters Alliance in general. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you, and especially in the company of Delegate Stewart and Delegate Wilkins and Senator Chairman Will Smith. They're great legislators and champions of many great causes, including economic equity and security. And as Vaughn said, last year, a little more than a year ago, as the legislative session was ending in 2020, we realized there was a lot of focus on criminal justice reform. And I think Chairman Smith and the Speaker of the House had pledged to do a broad overview and address criminal justice reform in the 2021 session. And the space that we knew was going to be challenging and difficult, namely the access to our civil justice system for folks who were impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, was not unattended, but not being thoroughly explored. And so we put together a task force, and the charge of the task force was to address precisely that. What are we going to do about access to justice while living through this crisis? And after we turn the corner on COVID-19, to ensure that people are housed, that they're fed, that they're healthy, that they're economically secure. And so we created this task force of about 40 some people, and we got experts from all over the state, business, academia, the legislature, and we then formed committees on a number of different subjects. And ultimately, we had more than 300 people participating in this endeavor. And the result was in December, the report of the accident, it's called the Attorney General's COVID-19 Access to Justice Task Force. We explained the problems, and we issued about 60 recommendations, and they covered all of the areas that I mentioned a minute ago, but the recommendations were designed to protect against unnecessary evictions and foreclosures, expand access to public benefits, because anybody who tried to obtain unemployment insurance benefits in the past 14 months knows what a mess it's been in Maryland. How we can protect people's health insurance, ensure that people are safe in their workplaces, and facilitate health and life planning decisions, which most people don't even think about until a family member is in the hospital and potentially on life support. And how we more effectively fund our civil justice or legal service providers. And we addressed all of those issues in the report of the commission. And there were, I think, 40 some bills addressed to the recommendations that we made. 12 or 13 of them passed, and I think we'll implement many of our recommendations. I want to talk to you in particular about the housing recommendations, because that's what the Renters Alliance is all about. And the task force made a series of recommendations, and I'll try to summarize them quickly. The first was that we increase the filing fee for summary ejectment actions, prohibit the fee from being passed on to tenants, and provide that the additional funds would be directed to legal services, and we hoped a right to counsel for tenants in rent court. Second was the actual requirement that there be a right to counsel in those situations. We had a series of due process reforms that we recommended for the eviction process, and we also recommended that there be a non-lapsing state fund for rental assistance and rehousing programs. And finally, that legislation be passed that allows the tenants to shield the filings against them, because I think you all know that if somebody's filed suit against you for eviction, it makes it extremely difficult to find new housing. Landlords see it in the judiciary case search and say, you know what, I'm going to pick somebody who hasn't had an action filed against them. And we thought it appropriate for landlords to know if somebody's actually been evicted, but not if landlords have filed an action against you. And I want to talk in greater detail about that, and about the first recommendation that we made, the recommendation to increase the filing fees. And I'm going to hope to share my screen with you and show you this PowerPoint. We thought that, let me see if I can get this to scroll now. There we go. The filing fees in Maryland to evict people from their homes is stunningly low. It's $15, and we're 48th in the country in terms of the amount of fees. I think there are only 2 states that are lower than Maryland, and the national average is $112. So, we introduced legislation to raise the eviction filing fee to $120 and to prohibit the landlords from passing that fee along to tenants. The reason we thought that was important is because the eviction filing rate in Maryland is astronomically high. You can see on this chart that in 2016, it was 83, nearly 84%. In other words, for every 100 units, there were 84 eviction filings in our state. And the national rate, as you can also see from this, is down around 6%. It's ranged from 2000 to 2016 from 6 to 7% and a little bit of change. But the Maryland rate is 13 or 14 times higher, or was in that period of time, 13 or 14 times higher than the national rate. And, we know from experience in our office, because we've brought suit against some major landlords, and it's because, they're charging fees that they shouldn't be charging. It's because they're forcing tenants to live in terrible, unhealthy conditions and refusing to maintain the properties. And in the course of those hearings and proceedings, we found that there were many landlords that file eviction actions as a matter of course on the first day they possibly can, on the 6th of the month. And they do that notwithstanding the fact that they have tenants who pay every month on the 10th. Yeah, they're late on the 5th. They know that, or late on the 6th. But they don't get paid until the 8th or the 9th. And so, you know, they pay the rent, you know, with certitude on the 10th of the month. But for some of these landlords, they're in court on the 6th. Tenants incur not only late fees, but also attorney's fees, court costs, agent fees, and a huge amount of inconvenience. You have to show up in court, take a day off from work. And as you can see from the chart that's up now, in 2016, the filing rates in Baltimore County were 1.5 times almost the number of rental units that there were in the county. Prince George's, again, over 100%, 123, nearly 124. Baltimore City, only 103%. And what this means is not that the every unit in the jurisdiction or the state has an eviction filing. It means that landlords file multiple times a year against the same units, against the same tenants. And you compare the eviction filing rates in Maryland to those of our surrounding states, and you can see that it ranges from 5% in Pennsylvania to 15% in DC, New Jersey, Virginia in the range of 15%, Delaware 16%, West Virginia much lower than the state of Maryland rate, which now, as of 2019, was 92.5%. It's just an astonishingly high rate. And this is just a summary of the bill that I mentioned before. We proposed that the filing fee be raised from $15 to $120 per filing, and it would prohibit the landlord from passing on the fee to the tenants. But unfortunately, the bill didn't make it across the finish line. Both the House and the Senate took action. The bill died. I think it's an extremely important initiative, and very sad to report that it didn't make it across the finish line, even when the fee was proposed to be $75 in the House or $50 in the Senate. There was a measure, and one of the ones that we recommended in the due process category that did pass, that I think will have an extremely helpful effect on this phenomenon of serial filings done by landlords. And it was originally sponsored by Delegate Melissa Wells. I think Delegate Wanika Fisher and Senator Shelley Heddleman incorporated it into a bill of theirs that passed. And what it would do is it would require the landlord to give notice to the tenant when the tenant is in default on the rent. It would give notice and tell them, if you don't pay the rent before then, we're going to sue you in 10 days. And first of all, there are lots of tenants who don't realize that they've been sued. They don't realize what their defenses are. They don't realize that they really need to show up in court or they're going to lose their home. And this notice will spell that out. It will give numbers for people to call legal services. And we think it will reduce, and we hope substantially, but not nearly as much as, we hope it'll reduce the serial filings in Maryland. It won't do the job that we believe that an increase in the fee and inability to pass it on would do, but we think it'll have a good impact. In addition to that, in the same bill, the bill started out as a right to counsel bill. It was supposed to be, you get a suit for eviction, you have a right to counsel. And it was changed to be an access to counsel bill. And I have to tell you, my initial reaction to that is there was nothing to it. But in the Biden legislation, I don't remember which bill it's in, but in the stimulus package of the Biden administration, there's money for access to counsel for tenants all over the country. And we believe that this bill that was enacted will allow the state of Maryland to have a good chance of getting a chunk of those funds. So we think it'll have a salutary impact. I'll leave it there. I look forward to your questions. I want to say again how lucky you are to have delegates Stewart and Wilkins as your representatives and Senator Smith as your senator. These guys are looking out for you. Each of them had initiatives, and especially Delegate Wilkins and Delegate Stewart both had initiatives that would have done good things for tenants. And I look forward to hearing from them about their legislation. And as I said, I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Before we turn it over, Will, to who's
Justin, introduce Justin. Yeah.
But just to point out that fee increase on the eviction filings was intended to be used to fund the right to counsel. And that's another thing that did not happen, unfortunately. Will?
Well, thanks so much, Matt, and thank you, Attorney General Frost. We definitely look forward to the conversation, and thanks for sharing, walking through that with folks. I'm going to turn it over to my board colleague, Justin Chappell, to introduce Will Smith.
Thank you again to the Attorney General for sharing his views on this past Maryland General Assembly session. And we want to welcome Maryland State Senator Will Smith, who represents District 20 here in Montgomery County, parts of Silver Spring and Tacoma Park, including White Oak and Long Branch. Senator Smith is the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Proceedings Committee, which considers a lot of legislation that is important to the Renters Alliance. And so without further ado, we're looking forward to hearing Senator Smith's views on key legislation that they considered this year that affects renters.
Excellent. Thank you, Justin. Good to see you as always. We had the pleasure of running with each other way back in the day. So it's good to see you. And Matt, thanks for everything you're doing. Chris and Will and Delegate Stewart and Brandy and Lorraine. It's good to see everyone. And obviously Delegate Wilkins, it's good to see you. Thank you for having me here this afternoon or this evening. And obviously it's an honor to serve with Delegate Stewart and Delegate Wilkins in the General Assembly. As the Attorney General pointed out, they were really the leaders in the General Assembly on housing protection this year. And so I just wanted the hats off to their work. And obviously the Attorney General spearheaded the task force, Access to Justice Task Force, and was calling me and prompting me and coaching me and pushing me every step of the way. So I appreciate the sage advice and the encouragement and all the stellar work that came out of the commission. Just taking it back, so I'll give you a rundown of what passed, what didn't, what the Senate did, what the House did, and kind of some work that was left undone and some regrets from this past session. But to do that, I'll just start all the way back at the beginning of the session, or before the beginning of the session, where we're still very much in the throes of the pandemic. And I formed a task force, put Senator Hettleman at the head of that task force to look at housing issues, to take a real deep dive to work with a number of the members of the Access to Justice Commission as well to help develop recommendations and policy prescriptions that we could implement during the legislative session. And the point of that was really to capture the moment that we're in and all the lessons learned that the pandemic had shown us. And I think, I really want to applaud Senator Hettleman for her work and then her continued work during the legislative session. So the first bill I'll talk about is the access to counsel, or the right to counsel bill that we passed out. It came over to the Senate, and it essentially provided for access to counsel on these landlord-tenant eviction proceedings, failure to pay rent proceedings, and the like. And what the access to counsel, the task force, kind of showed us and reiterated was that, look, if you've got access to counsel or you have a representative, 92% of those people that were there, they just don't have it. And so when you have counsel, you're going to have a more productive outcome and a more just outcome. So what this bill would have done was, obviously, as the Attorney General said, we would have provided that access to counsel. And what we did in the Senate was we took a bill. I remember we were in the last couple of weeks, and I basically stripped off an amendment from another bill, put it onto this bill, which is the 10-day notice provision. That idea, you're doing some research. DC, for instance, I think, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, has a 30-day kind of notice provision. We have now 10 days that, look, if they're going to move on a failure to pay rent or eviction proceeding, you have the 10 days notice, at which point your right to counsel, your access to counsel attaches. You're going to be given resources to help resolve that issue before you get to the district court. And there's a judicial economy argument to be made there as well. So not only are you going to have better outcomes, it's actually going to be better for our court system. So I think that's a win-win there. Obviously, that bill moves in tandem with the funding. And as the Attorney General laid out, which, look, our fees are higher than our regional partners. And the bill that the Attorney General put forward would have raised those fees from $15 to $120. I think what happened when we got it in the Senate, we raised it up to $85, and we prevented that pass through from happening. So I think we improved upon the bill as it came over from the House, and we raised it. We said, look, and we said you couldn't pass it through to the tenant. I think the House, when it came over, it was down to $75 or $65, and it said on the third time you could pass it through to the tenant. Now, obviously, in Maryland, we have 3 rights to redeem in a calendar year. In Baltimore City, you have 4. So I think we improved upon the bill in the Senate. Unfortunately, we didn't get it across the finish line in enough time. So we got out of the Senate, had a pretty vigorous floor fight on sine die, and we just didn't give enough time for the House to take action on that. So that's a regret there. That bill, as we passed it out, would have provided, I think, close to $45 million, and that would have funded the access to counsel. And part of that half of that would have funded the access to counsel.
Senator Smith, can I just add that I think on that bill, didn't they also add an amendment that was compromised that they would raise the fee and agree to no pass through, and that it would sunset in 3 years?
Yeah.
So that we could revisit it in 3 years if it had passed.
That's correct. So it would have sunset in 3 years. Also, I mean, we can get into the details as well. We also raised the filing fees for circuit court and district court for all filings, all court filings, and that would have generated a lot more money. So we can definitely dive into the details there, but broad stroke, no pass through for 3 years, it would have raised about $45 million for that access, part of which would have gone to that access to counsel fund. And so, as the Attorney General pointed out, we passed a really good access to counsel, first in the nation, added that 10-day notice provision, but you had the sidecar to that is the funding, and that's a critical component that is left undone at this moment in time. Another bill that we were able to get out of the General Assembly was the let's say the Relief Act funding came out of B&T. That's $3 million that the chair of B&T was able to get out on the Senate side that would go to the Access to Counsel Fund. Termination of the tenancy, like the notification period, which we have in Montgomery County, which is a 60-day notice, expanded that to as a statewide measure. So that is now a statewide measure as of October 1. And tenant screening. So Senator Hettleman had a bill that would have allowed you to have the same application. You fill it out once, have one credit check, and you can go to multiple different units to provide as an application instead of having to fill it out over and over again. Lots of collateral consequences there with credit reporting, and again with efficiencies that don't inure to the tenants or the potential tenants' benefit. So a couple things that I think we made some significant progress, but again, that funding piece is a significant regret that I have. Also, what you'll hear from Delegate Janelle Wilkins' bill, that I'll leave it to her to discuss because it's her product. That bill we got out, obviously was stripped down significantly from the House, and we got it in the Senate. We didn't take quick enough action on that amidst the 90-day legislative session. So that's a regret that I've got on that. We got it out of the Senate committee, out of my committee, and I made a motion to have 2 readings in one day. And if you go back on the floor fight, that was a floor fight, not just Republicans, but Democrats as well. So it was just a very, the opposition came from both parties. And I, failed in my motion to have 2 readings in one day, which is a procedural maneuver that would have allowed us to get that over to the House with the hopes that they were able to take some quick action there. And it didn't happen. So that's a regret that I have there as well. So a lot done, a lot to be done. And so I appreciate all the work that's gone in. I appreciate my colleagues, and I look forward to the questions this afternoon. So thank you all for having me. It's been a real honor and pleasure.
Hear me now? My mute button sticks sometimes, even though it's virtual. Thank you, Senator Smith, and see some questions being generated in the chat already, and look forward to the discussion that we'll all have together. I'll turn it over now to my board colleague, Sophia, to introduce Delegate Janelle Wilkins.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce my Renter Alliance board colleague, who is one of Montgomery County's leading champions for renters' rights and protection. She is also a renter and renters activist. She served as a delegate to the Maryland General Assembly, representing thousands of renters in District 20 as our state delegate. Tonight, she will share with us her legislative efforts. Please help me welcome Delegate Janelle Wilkins.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much to this board and my colleagues, Delegate Stewart, Senator Smith, Attorney General Brian Frosh, for all of the work this legislative session in terms of working on renters issues. Again, I'm Delegate Janelle Wilkins. I represent District 20 along with Senator Smith, which is the Silver Spring, Tacoma Park, and White Oak areas. And I am a renter right here in downtown Silver Spring, and have long been passionate prior to being in the legislature about renters' rights issues. And so this conversation is very near and dear to my heart. And as everyone on this call knows, we've been raising the flag ever since the pandemic started about the issue of a housing crisis that would be looming. So none of what has taken place is new or surprising. When we weren't in session, we were making demands of Governor Hogan for him to act independently. We were calling for rent freezes and all of those things. And now here we are. We are in a housing emergency. We are in a crisis. And we have over 200,000 Maryland families at risk of losing their homes. We knew this going into legislative session in January, that over 200,000 Maryland families are at risk of losing their homes. And during the last few weeks of the legislative session, the Maryland courts opened back up to failure to pay rent cases. And I understand the courts are pretty much fully open now. And so that the evictions that have been staved off due to the courts sort of being closed to these types of cases are now opening back up, and our worst fears could be realized. So the question that we have to ask ourselves as legislators is, what policies and safeguards, knowing what we know, knowing that this crisis is looming, knowing that we have asked people to stay in their homes, and their homes have been their only protection and lifeline for over a year, going into a year and a half of this pandemic, what policies and safeguards did we put in place to keep people housed and safe and protected? And what did we leave on the table? And I'm not going to sugarcoat it for this audience. We didn't do enough at all this legislative session. I think the purpose of this conversation is just recap, get us all on the same page about what happened, what we got done, what we didn't get done. And so my take on it is that I think the Maryland General Assembly really failed Maryland families this legislative session. Going into session, knowing what we know about the risk that people are under, knowing what we know about the amount of rent debt that has accrued and the protections that are not in place for renters. I think that we were up against a lot of powerful interests. You know, the landlord lobby and their allies and the county associations and others, they were right there testifying in opposition, working behind the scenes with members when many of our renters, you know, were working just to keep the roof over their heads. The landlord, very powerful landlord lobby was working hard. We had time not on our side in terms of having a 90-day session where we're up against the clock. There are other issues that we're competing against. And there's also a huge challenge that I think is really important to voice around the fact that, you know, there's a stereotype that renters are not voters, renters are not engaged, renters are not writing checks. And therefore, in terms of getting issues prioritized, you know, that is sort of a stereotype that we're also up against as compared to the landlord lobby that's always there, always voicing their concerns around these issues. But with all of that said, with this being a priority issue, and if this was a priority, we would have gotten done what we needed to get done, and we did not do that. As was mentioned, the good news is that right to counsel, access to counsel is a big deal. First in the nation to have access to counsel. And I think that the challenge is that there were a number of other bills that would have made that access to counsel actually even more robust and meaningful for the communities that it is there to serve. The impact of the bills that we left on the table really cannot be overemphasized. So, for example, you have a right to counsel, but you owe several $1,000s to your landlord. Whether you have an attorney or don't have an attorney, you owe those funds. And a lot of times, depending on the current program and the various programs that are coming in, your landlord can still turn around, get those funds, and potentially still file for an eviction. By the same token, again, many people are having their leases are coming up due. We had the opportunity to put in place lease protections during this pandemic so that people would not be put out in the street that when their lease ends during a pandemic. And so again, whether you have an attorney or don't have an attorney, there are no protections in place legally to allow you to be able to stay in your home past your lease, even during this pandemic. So the point that I'm making is that is not at all to discourage the amazing work of Delegate Fisher, Senator Hettleman, in terms of the access to counsel legislation, which I'm really proud of, but it's to say that because we left so many other protections on the table, that it actually leaves gaps and challenges in place in terms of being able to actually stave off this eviction crisis. Another challenge and disappointment that I do want to lift up is that my legislation, House Bill 1312, which was emergency protections and rent relief for renters, particularly during COVID-19, came in really strong. It had an eviction moratorium in it. It includes just cause eviction, which includes tenant protections at the end of your lease, which is a bill that I have been working to advance for several years. It included know your rights legislation. It was a kitchen sink of provisions that would help ensure that people stay in their homes. That bill did pass the House. It was watered down, but it had 3 strong provisions as it passed the House. One thing was codifying Governor Hogan's affirmative defense, which you are probably aware currently, if you're able to provide and prove a substantial loss of income, that a renter would be able to have a stay on their eviction and keep their home during the COVID-19 pandemic. It also had a rent freeze that would prohibit rent increases everywhere in the state and prohibit fines and fees, which I can't emphasize how big of a deal it is to have a rent freeze pass the House of Delegates. There have been, in my time in the legislature, and I would say probably dating back even 10 years before that at least, any strong rent provision has been just shut down. And so to have a rent freeze pass our House, it really shows progress that we're making. Another important aspect of the bill as it passed the House was that it made, it created real-time eviction data, because I see someone did ask in the chat about, is this data publicly available? The answer is yes, but you're looking at months in the past. So at the beginning of this conversation, when I started talking, I talked about the fact that now that the time is real where the courts are opening back up. But if we're looking at data from several months ago, that doesn't help us to be able to react, to be able to work with the governor, maybe put forth some stopgap measures and so on and so forth. We are months lagging behind when it comes to eviction data a lot of times. So this bill, very critical housing bill, sat in the Senate for 2 to 3 weeks on our challenging timeline and didn't get to the floor until the last day of session. So this bill ran out of time. And, understanding the constraints that we're all under of time, the importance of getting the policing work done. But at the same time, for something like this, where 200,000 plus renters are counting on us to know that that bill did not make it across the finish line, that it was on the third reader to get a final vote before we closed out, is just a difficult pill to swallow, quite honestly, knowing the crisis that we are under. And so with that, what I have to say to renters is that I think that we should all be very disappointed in terms of the job not getting done, in terms of this being a huge priority issue. And I think that based on the fact that so much was left on the table, I think that tells us a lot. It says a lot. And we have a lot of organizing to do. We have a lot of demands to make. And in the meantime, the most important thing is not the finger pointing, but it's figuring out how we make sure that with what we have in place, that people are able to keep the roof over their heads as much as possible. And we'll be continuing to do that work as the board of the Renters Alliance and funds that are coming into the state and in other ways. So thank you so much for your time. And thank you to every single renter out there that raised their voice, even while trying to keep the roof over your head. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you, Delegate Wilkins, my board colleague and longtime friend, for speaking so passionately and working so hard, as we know you do on all of these issues. Before we open it up to discussion, I do want to kick it, Metro, our colleague, another board colleague, Delegate Vaughn Stewart, to talk about some of the work that you've done during the session as well. And then we can sort of open up the discussion to our panel and get ready to hear from some of the folks who are here as well. Go ahead, Vaughn.
Sure. Thank you, Will. Again, great to be here with everyone this evening. I won't be repetitive. The Attorney General and Chairman Smith and my friend and colleague in the House, Delegate Wilkins, all did a great job summarizing both the sort of the ups and downs of the session. So I don't want to repeat what was already said. But first, let me just say that it's great to be with those three of my colleagues, as well as all my fellow board members. This is really kind of a banner group here that has been fighting now for more than a year during the pandemic to make sure that renters have a shred of dignity and can remain in their homes in extremely challenging times. And so I even though, I think that I share Delegate Wilkins' sort of somber assessment of the legislative session, I'm really grateful to all of you on this call and everyone who fought for strong versions of all these bills during the session. And I think I would just agree with Delegate Wilkins that basically two things are true. First, this was the most productive session on the issue of housing, probably in the history of the Maryland General Assembly. That's true. Janelle is right that in past years, I've only been there since 2019, but in past years, to even get a single housing bill, a single pro-tenant bill out of just the House would have been cause for immense celebration. And we not only got several strong bills out of the House, but several strong bills all the way through. including the access to council bill, which makes us the first in the nation. Now we just have to fund it, as everyone said. But the second thing that's true, sadly, is that it wasn't nearly enough. As folks on this call know, nearly a quarter of Marylanders were housing insecure, basically a fancy way of saying they didn't have enough money for the rent before anyone had even heard of COVID-19. And now every expert in the world, if you Google it, says that we're facing a wave of evictions in July when the CDC affirmative defense finally comes to an end. And I think when that happens, the pain that we feel and the regrets that we have over this session will only be magnified once we actually see waves of people out in the streets with their belongings in the road because they're now facing homelessness. And I just, after a tough legislative session where it always felt like we were on the defensive and always kind of had to fight for every piece, I just want to say one quote that you all may remember from a few months ago. And it's quote unquote, few states coddle landlords as indulgently as does Maryland, where it's open season on tenants all year, every year. And that quote is not from some sort of radical politician. It's not from some sort of left-wing blog. That quote is from the Washington Post editorial board, which hardly has a radical left-wing reputation. And so when they're saying that so plainly and so flatly, I think it gives, it makes those of us in Annapolis raise our eyebrows, because even some of these milquetoast bills are treated as absolutely crazy by a lot of our colleagues, as Chairman Smith said, on both sides of the aisle. And so with that, I'll just mention two of my bills in the kind of what I would consider, I'm obviously not going to call my own legislation milquetoast, but it's certainly on the sort of more reasonable common sense end of the spectrum, one which passed and one which didn't. Well, first, Chairman Smith already mentioned one of my bills that passed, the Senate version passed, that does make it statewide that now landlords have to provide 2 months notice instead of 1 month notice before declining to renew someone's lease. And that's a small step in the right direction. Montgomery County has obviously already had that, so it doesn't help folks in Montgomery County, but at least everyone else around the state, there will be a statewide standard. And at least before you get thrown out, you'll get 30 days more notice, which is not obviously a transformative policy, but it's something. I'll take it. Another thing I'll take is that, and this is an issue that doesn't always come up in Montgomery County, but is a big issue statewide as well, which is I had a bill that was really controversial on the House side, at least, that would require landlords, or will require landlords, to test their private well water and remediate any poison before poisoning their tenants. And I don't bring this up because Montgomery County has lots of private wells. It doesn't, though there are some tenants in Montgomery County who will be affected by this bill. I bring it up only to underscore the point I made, which is that this bill, to me, couldn't have been more common sense, the idea that landlords should not poison their tenants with well water. But to hear some of our colleagues talk about this bill on both sides of the aisle, in committee and on the House and Senate floor, actually not the Senate floor, just the House floor, you would think that this was a proto-Marxist proposal. And I think it underscores something Janelle said, which is not only the power of the landlord lobby, but the fact that they have not only sympathizers who are members of the General Assembly, they have their colleagues who are in the Maryland General Assembly. In other words, large percentages of your representatives, not necessarily your representatives, but Maryland's representatives in the General Assembly are landlords themselves. And they cite their own experiences when they fight back against even the most tepid of reforms. And then finally, those are the two good things. Both of those bills passed. Now, the downside is I have a bill called the Tenant Protection Act, HB 50. And this one is really personal to me because I modeled it off my own experience in Montgomery County. I actually kind of came to political activism in Montgomery County, as Matt would tell you, through the Renters Alliance. And kind of the first thing I ever really did in Montgomery County was try to organize my own building into a tenants association. And when we tried to do so, the landlord called the police on us. And we were eventually able to have the meeting, and then we had several meetings after that. But it shows that no matter what building you're in or what part of Montgomery County you're in, you can face resistance when you're just trying to exercise your rights. That bill led that effort led to Bill 1915, on the county level, I tried to replicate a lot of those victories in HB 50, which also fell short. And I would just close by saying that, you know, in terms of what's next, I would just say that we can't be complacent about the big 1 or 2 victories that we did have in the legislative session of 2021. The General Assembly has a tendency to do something in a substantive area of policy 1 year and then pat itself on the back for 2 to 10 years after that and not come back to that area. We cannot let that happen on the issue of housing. We did make big steps forward. Big shout out to Chairman Smith, Delegate Wilkins, and the Attorney General on the steps that we did make. But there's still a lot of pain and a lot of future hopelessness and a lot of future homelessness that's out there, even after this pandemic fully subsides. And we cannot let up. We've got to keep fighting. We've got to keep organizing. And I look forward to doing a lot of both with everyone on this call within the next year, 2 years, and going forward.
Vaughn, whenever you tell that story, I always have to remind you that the 2 guests that you invited to participate in that renter organizing meeting at your building was this fellow by the name of Mark Elrich and this other fellow by the name of Jamie Raskin. What a mistake they made when they called the cops.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Vaughn and Matt, for that. And, you know, we're going to open up our discussion in a second. I think all of you have, you know, really encapsulated sort of the tough spot that we're in, right? Not wanting to ignore the real strides that have been made through this session, but also needing to address the work left on the table and what that means for real people. And so, you know, some of what I want us to discuss is, you know, how are we going to be able to cobble together these component parts to figure out how to make sure we're providing as many protections as we can for renters, you know, whom are not just, you know, numbers as we've talked about, but they're real people facing some real issues. So, but as we jump into that, I want to turn to my board colleagues, first Chris and then Brandy, just to talk about some of the things that, you know, we as Renters Alliance know that, you know, some folks have been experiencing, and to really set the table for what we're going to discuss, which is how do we help pull people back. So Chris, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, a couple of things occur to me from our conversation this evening. One is that we're not out of the pandemic yet. I work with the Maryland Department of Health as a contact tracer, and I see a rise, particularly in cases among young people. We are definitely not out of the woods. That means that there are people out there who are going to be evicted, who are going to lose their homes when they have family members who are sick or are trying to recover. I want to know 2 things. Number one, how can we help those people who are in crisis right now? That will be a challenge for us. And the other thing is, we knew what we were getting into this legislative session. We knew the challenges, yet we did not have our ducks in a row. Now, what can we do to do that? That's my question. Thank you.
Brandy, you want to dive in before we get into the conversation?
Yeah, I was going to say, why don't we do the other part of
Yeah,
setting? But
I do. Thank you, Delegate Wilkins, Delegate Stewart, Attorney General Frosch. Thank you, Senator Smith, for coming and for giving us this breakdown. You know, as a advocate and someone interested in policy, I want to appreciate and acknowledge what Delegate Stewart highlighted about the fact that these are some of the biggest movements that we've seen in the Maryland General Assembly. But as a renter and as someone who has to look at the impacts that this can have on my family, I am appalled and angry. And saying to people who are facing eviction, who are housing insecure, look, we got you 10 feet or 50 feet out of the 1,000-foot pit you're in, is wholly insufficient. And I think we need to be frank about that. We needed more leadership. I am so thankful for colleagues and for representatives like Delegate Wilkins, Delegate Stewart, and some of their other colleagues who fought for this every day. And I simply want to acknowledge that this is an utter failure of leadership for a significant portion of Marylanders by our General Assembly. And I think people need to take that seriously because it is something that we knew about. It is something that people have been raising the alarm on for over a year. And for us not to have taken care of that, there are thousands of people in our county who are about to face, who are currently facing eviction courts, thousands of families that are going to be put out, which is going to make everything from education to holding down a job to trying to make sure that they don't get COVID and get sick or die infinitely harder. And that's their reality. And they are not going to want to hear from us that we tried. So at this point, we need to make sure everyone who wants to claim that they are an advocate for renters in the state of Maryland or in Montgomery County needs to make sure that since we did not get what needed to be done on the state level, that we are making every possible move to ensure that federal level funds get to the state of Maryland and get to our counties and get to renters. We need to make sure that people are organizing their colleagues to make sure that Maryland gets a chunk of that money. And then we need to make sure that people are organizing with their county level colleagues to make sure that that money gets effectively to renters in terms of rent relief, as well as in terms of appropriate support for legal aid and preventative support so people who are not yet in this pipeline don't get there. Regret is an insufficient response to this ongoing crisis and the failure to take sufficient action. Now it has to be action. And there are things that we have coming up, things that we're going to be hearing more about. There's a $59 million rent relief fund that is here in Montgomery County, for instance, that we need to make sure is effectively getting out to renters. We are currently in the midst of Montgomery County's budget cycle, where we also need to be making sure that there is not just the rent relief funding, but funding to the organizations that assist tenants with legal aid and with preventative services and with knowing their rights and knowing their organizing. There can be no more excuses because thousands of us, 40% of this county are renters, and thousands of us are facing housing insecurity and potential homelessness. So all people want to hear, and I'm seeing this in the chat, is how are you going to take care of that? And that's my challenge to every elected official who had the power to move this and didn't. People want to know how you're going to take care of it.
So why don't we, thank you, Brandy and Chris. So why don't we start our discussion there with, how are we going to find a solution to where we are, and to frame the question that Brandy framed, how are we going to take care of these folks who are facing down still a serious crisis? So I want to certainly start, Senator Smith and Attorney General Frost, start with you all, and then we can sort of open it up and have a discussion here.
Thanks, Will, and thanks, Brandy, for your comments and just your kind of just laying it out there. Same thing with Chris and your candor. No, I think that, look, you've got three levels of government that are in operation here. You've got the federal government, which is dispersing to Maryland close to a little bit more than $800 million of rental assistance funds. That money will go directly to the counties, and the counties are going to have to decide how and to parse that up. Okay, so you've got that level. You've got the state level, which we have talked about, the shortcomings and then some of the strides forward that we've made there. And you've got the county level that can take action, not only in dispersing the money, but also in implementing new policies for protecting renters in terms of this. There's a moratorium in place, obviously, for evictions. The courts are opening up. Phase 4 courts are opening up. District courts are opening up. And there's no guarantee that the moratorium gets extended. That's purely under the purview of the governor. And if you talk to a lot of the housing advocates, they'll tell you that even with an executive order and a moratorium, there are still evictions happening, whether from prior action or for other things like nuisance or whatever the like. People are still getting evicted from their homes. And so that moratorium doesn't necessarily protect those folks, even in the midst of a pandemic. And so the candid answer I can tell you is, look, making sure that when we have that federal pass through, that money gets through for the rental assistance, so the money is paid, because even the moratorium doesn't absolve people of their rent liability. And you still have to jump through a couple of hurdles to prove that you're actually impacted through the pandemic. So that's the number one thing, is maintain that watchdog level of oversight and implementation as that money comes through. The second is to have those ducks in a row when we come back, as you said. When we come, if 200,000 Marylanders that could be potentially subject to, they're facing this prospect of eviction, right, in the next couple months. If the feds don't act, if the state doesn't act, if the county doesn't act, I'll be the first person, not only in the streets, but in the halls of Annapolis, to call for a special session to make sure we get it right. So you got my commitment here on that. And not to, look, this session was, and I've got a lot of reflection on this session, and it's a peculiar session on a multitude of different levels, from police reform to post-conviction parole, JRA, governor out of parole, dignity not detention, the whole gambit of issues that span the scope of interest. And, Brandy, to your point, is as a renter and as a significant portion of the population in Montgomery County and in the state of Maryland, folks that think that, look, we don't participate, we don't show up at the ballot box, and so our voices in the hurts are always put on the back burner. I'll have to tell you that that's absolutely not the case. But yes, there is, and I use the word regret, but there was a failure, and I regret that failure to act on certain measures earlier in the session. Time is the most valuable commodity during the legislative session, but it's also the most valuable commodity when you're facing eviction. So I fully understand that, and I'm looking forward to not only being in the streets, but also in the halls of Annapolis, call for a special session if we start to see that cascading effect. And we need to take more preventative action to make sure that it doesn't happen. So I appreciate the candor, and I appreciate the advocacy. So
let me just throw in for our audience that's listening, we will get into more depth about the governor's order and the CDC eviction orders and how they apply and don't apply. So stay tuned for that when the Department of Housing and Community Affairs has their time. Maybe Attorney General Frost would like to mention something on that as well.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to respond to Brandy and say very simply, we'll be back. Our office will be back before the General Assembly in the 2022 session. I think that the legislation that I described before is imperative. As I say, we have the serial eviction problem and serial eviction filing problem. We have among the lowest fees in the country. And if we raise them, we'll raise significant amounts of money for legal services for tenants, either through a right to counsel, access to counsel, or just more lawyers who can represent tenants. A couple of statistics that I find really dispiriting and shocking. Only about 3% of tenants who are sued for eviction show up in court. The notice provision that the General Assembly passed, I think, will help with that. You can't win the lottery unless you buy a ticket. You're not going to win an eviction lawsuit if you don't show up in court. And most tenants don't understand that they have defenses. I mean, first of all, Larry Hogan's executive order is not a moratorium. It allows tenants to raise affirmative defenses that they're not usually allowed to raise, namely that they've lost their job as a result of the pandemic, or they're suffering from some other situation, and but you have to go into court, and you have to know how to assert the defenses that will get you the stay of execution in effect. If we can increase the fee, raise money for legal services, because they only, of the tenants that come to them, they only have the horsepower to represent about 20%. So, and worse than that, this year, 2020, they were essentially on the brink of bankruptcy. They were out of money. There are two sources before this legislative session. There were two sources of funding for the Maryland Legal Services Corporation, and that's the entity that funds legal aid. It funds the Maryland Disability Law Center. It funds the Public Justice Center. It funds the lawyers who represent poor people in court. And they get money until this session from interest on lawyers' trust accounts. Well, the interest on lawyers' trust accounts are the same rates that you're getting on your checking accounts or savings accounts. Nothing. You know, the rates are down to just about zero. And so that stream of income cratered. Their second stream of income is filing fees, and that cratered because the courts weren't open, so people weren't filing cases. So they were on the edge of laying off huge swaths of staff and cutting funding to all of their client organizations who provide services. We had settled a residential mortgage-backed securities case. I think it was against. I think it was against Wells Fargo, but I got to be honest, I'm not sure. And we paid back all the counties that had lost money. We paid back all the cities that had lost money out of the settlement that we had reached. And we had $8.7 million left over. We had to get Governor Hogan's permission, but he gave it. And it allowed us to give $8.7 million to the Legal Services Corporation to keep them afloat until this year's legislative session. So, you know, now you have, and I can't remember if anybody mentioned it, but the Unclaimed Property Fund is going to increase its contribution to legal services up to $6 million. I believe it was at $2 million. So there's a significant chunk of money that will go to legal services that wasn't before. And let me say, you know, we have hard choices to make between rental assistance and legal representation. To be brutally honest, in my unscientific estimation, you get more bang for your buck if you get people lawyers than if you get them rental assistance, because most of them have defenses that they haven't thought to raise, don't know to raise. And lawyers, when they're living in miserable conditions that violate the housing codes of various jurisdictions, they can put their rent into escrow and force the landlord to improve the conditions, make the repairs that are necessary, et cetera. So they've got leverage they don't know about. And if you can get them lawyers, you can help them keep their homes. So I think that's an excellent investment. The money that's coming from the Biden stimulus package is flexible in that it can go to rental assistance, but it can also go to legal services. And with the Access to Counsel bill, we've opened the door, I think, a little bit wider to getting money for legal assistance. I think that will be a huge help. I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture here. Things are dire. I was saying a year ago that we were facing an eviction tsunami. We still are. It's been postponed and postponed and postponed, but it does mean, as one of my colleagues said a few minutes ago, that, you know, folks now have months and sometimes more than a year of rent that's in arrears. And the day of judgment is going to come. Sooner or later, they're going to have to either make an arrangement with the landlord, pay the rent, or leave. And all those folks, they need legal representation, they need rental assistance. Our office is going to continue to do everything we can think of to avoid what looks to me like a housing catastrophe on the short-term horizon.
I want to add to something that you said, Attorney General Frosch, because I know you're a lawyer and you're the Attorney General, which gives you that particular perspective. But one of the things that the Renters Alliance has been emphasizing, and that some of my colleagues also emphasized, and way back in the day when I was in college, I used to work in Hilton Haven Hospital in the emergency room for 2 years. 7 in the evening till 7 in the morning with an 8-10 Friends class. I didn't do very well. But one of the things we learned in the emergency room was how terrible a place it was to do public health. Public health is generally done in the field early with an education component, working directly with people so that well before they get into serious trouble with their health. And we like to use that comparison or that analogy in the housing outreach. It's good to have a lawyer when you need one. That's like getting the doctor when you get to the emergency room. But we think we want to get to these people well before they get into this eviction pipeline, when they know they're going to be months behind in rent, when they need to consider other housing alternatives, when they need to start preparing their case if they are in fact going to end up going to court. And perhaps most importantly, and we'll be discussing this in a few minutes with our colleagues at DHCA and HHS, but knowing what resources are available to them in the first place, from their rights to the government resources, to the rental relief funds, and so on, and other housing options and ways to negotiate with their landlords. Just today, I received a copy of a notice to vacate telling somebody they have to be out in a few days and that they're going to come in at midnight and turn out the lights. They can't do that, as you know.
Right.
And yet many people do not know this and don't
Right.
understand the lay of the land or what to do. So providing some of that funding for the Renters Alliance and other partners that do this early, direct, personal outreach to tenants is a critical part of the holistic view of this eviction tsunami.
I agree with you, Matt. Can I make?
Please.
I agree with you just about everything you said. I neglected to make one more point, and it's in partial response to Brandy, and that is you can't be too hard on the legislators here. We never got to a critical step in the process because the bills didn't pass. But I can personally guarantee you that all the bills we've been discussing that failed would have been vetoed by Governor Hogan. And you need 60% of the House and Senate to override a veto like that. I'm not sure we were looking at veto-proof majorities when it came to the passage of these bills, if it had come to pass. If we had gotten to that point in the process, I'm not sure we could have mustered the votes. But
That's
it means we have to try harder.
Yeah,
That's a very sad comment. Will, if I could just add one more thing.
certainly. Briefly. Yeah.
Another question, which was brought up earlier. Maybe Attorney General Frost, this may not be your lane, but you are who you are. And maybe Senator Smith or the other representatives can speak to it. But we have been concerned, the Renters Alliance and our allies at Renters United Maryland, which we were co-founder of that statewide coalition, are concerned about the conflict of interest that exists in the Maryland General Assembly, and wondering what can be done to strengthen the ethics rules that say a landlord who is a state senator or happens to be a chair of a housing committee in the General Assembly. What can we say when they are advocating for legislation that advances their financial interests, or they are advocating against legislation that might impinge on their financial interests? Isn't this fundamentally a conflict of interest?
It is. And the ethics laws say that you have to disclose your interests. And then you have to, if you have a conflict, you have to say, well, I'm a landlord, but I believe I can vote in the public interest nevertheless. And I'm a landlord. And it never stopped me from being a champion for tenants and an enemy for landlords. I mean, I'm public enemy number one, I think, for the Washington, D.C. and the Baltimore-based landlords associations. You have to elect people who are going to represent and support you. And look, the job is only 3 months of the year, people think. It's much more than that. And the higher up in the ranks you rise, the more demands on your time there are. The legislators aren't paid enough. I think it's $50,000 a year. They aren't paid enough to make it a full-time job if they're the sole support of their family. or at least it's difficult. And it means that people who are more comfortable are more likely to make the financial sacrifice than people who need to make ends meet, live paycheck to paycheck, and don't have an employer who will accommodate taking 3 months off in the beginning of the year, and then a couple of days a week the rest of the year. So one way to fix the problem would be to make it a full-time job, pay people for a full-time job, and then you can say whatever you want about conflicts of interest. But as long as you have a part-time legislature, there are going to be conflicts of interest.
Well, clearly in a pure sense, but some of these conflicts of interest are rather extraordinary. We're not talking about somebody who owns a house or a condo and rents it out. Some of them actually are landlords for large landlord interests and have multiple properties and are professional landlords. And so there might be some way to look at this in a graduated sort of way. But clearly some of them are advocating as a business interest over their public interest.
So certainly, before we, I know we're gonna get to the the portion of the next portion of our discussion in a bit, when we're able to talk to some of our county partners about programs and how people can access those. But I do want to I know Delegate Wilkins and Delegate Stewart want to hop in on that last part of the discussion. So why don't you two go ahead? Go ahead, Janelle.
Thank you, Will. And I want to get people over quickly into the aspect of how they can get help right now if they need it. And that's the next portion of the conversation. I see a lot of questions about that, and we are going to answer those. We have panelists here for that. In terms of the question about what we as legislators can do, one of the things that I want to point out that relates to my remarks is that today's date is April 28th, 2021. The latest eviction data that we have is from December 2020. How can we fix something without having up-to-date data in terms of when these evictions are taking place, what types of evictions are there, so that we can really raise the alarm and continue to address this issue? So I think that's something that's important. Is I would like to work with Attorney General Frosh and Senator Smith as chair of judicial proceedings to work with our court system to provide us with more real-time data so that we can actually know what is going on. And it's important for everyone on this line to be in touch with your elected officials with the challenges that are taking place. If people go back into session and they haven't heard from their constituents that this has been an issue, that they're behind in their rent, we'll end up in the same place that we have been this legislative session. So don't skip over your state and county elected officials as you work to address the problems and the challenges, because it's important that they hear from you and that we are your advocates as well. I think that the two main aspects of why people are going to be facing these challenges, potential evictions, have to do with of course, money and the financial burden. And that's the aspect of the Montgomery County Rent Relief Program that's open right now that we're going to talk about. And I think that our role as elected officials is to just ensure accountability in that process, that process is as accessible as possible, and that the money is getting in the hands of the people who need it as quickly as possible. So that's what the number one thing that I see as my role coming up, is to work to ensure, whether it's door knocking, getting the word out about this program, and making sure that people are able to get the money that they need and access it. And the other final aspect of evictions that will take place is related to leases that are coming due. And unfortunately, we currently do not have any protections in place. There are questions about that as well. There are no protections related to end of lease. That's a separate bill that I've been working on for several years now. And we need to ring the alarm as well about this issue to build up the momentum for those protections to be in place during this pandemic, but also beyond.
Well, I can't If you're talking, I don't think we can hear you.
Oh no, sorry. Can you hear me now? Perfect. Delegate Stewart was gonna invite you in case you had any thoughts on sort of where
Delegate Stewart was reading your lips, but I wasn't sure. So yeah, no, thank you. And sorry, my internet kicked me off briefly, but I'm back. So I missed some of the context and some of the questions, but just on this point about what can we do now to keep folks in their home collectively. I was honored to serve on a statewide work group convened by the Senate President and the Speaker and the Hogan administration. And we basically worked with DHCD, which is the State Housing Authority, on the parameters for the state's allotment of federal funds. And I don't know if folks realize this, but basically from like January through March, we received almost $1 billion from the federal government for emergency rental assistance, which by far dwarfs the amount we had received throughout 2020. So it has been a sea change in terms of the amount of cash infusion that we've gotten just in the last few months, thanks to the federal government, than what we had when folks were really, there were long wait lists, there were long lines, there was a lot of administrative, bureaucratic concerns. A lot of it's just stemmed from lack of money. We probably still don't have enough money to meet the need, but we have a lot more money than we did. And one thing the work group I was on really pushed the state agency to do is to be tougher on landlords. If they take this money, one thing we forced the state agency to tell them is for all these county programs, the landlord takes money, you can't then turn around and evict someone or decline to renew their lease for several months afterward. And if you have any ongoing evictions and you receive money, you have to cancel that ongoing eviction upon receipt of upon application of that money. And we did a number of other things. I won't get into the details because I know that the second half of the program is going to be dedicated to this issue. But we as legislators, whether you serve on the work group like I did or all of us, Janelle is absolutely right that we have to make sure we keep our foot on the gas to make sure that all this money we got is well spent and that we leverage every single dollar to its maximum effect. And then we get the dollars out the door as quickly as humanly possible. There is basically a big equity component to this, but there's maybe an even bigger efficiency component that we're not just sitting on this money and that folks are not able to access it because of too much documentation requirements or too much red tape. And so I was happy to serve in that role. And I have actually a fair amount of confidence that this kind of next round of rental assistance is going to be not only more well administered, but just much more well funded.
Thanks so much for that, Delegate Stewart. As we're preparing to turn this over and hear from some of our county partners, if you're like me, you've been sitting here, I've been trying to take notes as we're talking, just because even though this is work that we do every day, trying to catch great nuggets of information from folks. So I hope that people were able to take out of this discussion as much as I was. And I hope that for folks who aren't on this call, that you can share it with folks. It's recorded on YouTube, and I know, Matt, we're going to send it out. So definitely make sure to share this out, because it's great information that we need people to have, not only to know some of the fantastic resources that are available to people, but ways in which, as you're talking to your other legislators, and we thank our legislators for being here, about what happened this session and about what we can do moving forward. You heard some of that, some of the ways that we need our leaders to be prepared and at bat, as not just as we come up to the next session, but to make sure that this funding that is flowing down from the federal government to the state and the counties is used in the ways that you've heard talked about, closing some of these loopholes that we've heard people talk about. As Matt and Brandy pointed out, and something that you've probably heard us say before, but something I don't want you to lose, our philosophy about early interdiction and getting to people before they're in eviction pipelines isn't just sort of a bumper sticker philosophy. It's a strategy that we as the Renters Alliance believe is the best way to employ in the field to make sure that people are able to avoid eviction. And so as you've heard, when we're having conversations at our local level about budgetary priorities and where this funding is going, for different organizations to be out there in the field and doing this work, make sure you're asking not just our state legislators, but our council members about what, and the county executive about how these decisions are being made with all of our resources, how those are being prioritized. So, you know, I want to thank everybody who participated tonight. Thank all of our panelists, my board colleagues, Attorney General Frost, Senator Smith, Mr. Chairman, Delegate Stewart, Delegate Wilkins, our colleagues for a really full discussion. And this is not the end, right? This is just sort of pulling on some threads so we can figure out where to go from here. So stay tuned and hang in there, folks. Now, I'm going to shift it back to, I'm going to kick it back to you, Matt, to talk about to introduce the next segment of the program, which I know a lot of people have questions about.
Thank you, Will, and thank you to all of our panelists again. Very informative. Alas, so much more to discuss, so little time, but we sure are privileged to have you. Thank you for your personal attention. We are very grateful. Senator Smith, we look forward to following up with you and Attorney General Frost especially. There's certain steps we could take, maybe setting up meetings, meeting with the governor, things that can happen well before we get into that speedy, crazy pipeline of the Maryland General Assembly in 2022. Much we can do in advance. But for our delegates who are here, the legislative part of the discussion is now concluded. We thank you. You can, I know that you've got 16 other things to do tonight. Your day is not over, so we thank you. You're welcome to stay, but you certainly don't have to. So thank you, everybody, the delegates. And now we will welcome our partners at the Department of Housing and Community Affairs. Frank Desmarais, you with us?
Yes, yes, sir.
There he is. We've just awakened him. Frank Desmarais, the Deputy Director of Housing and Community Affairs, will now take the next section and introduce his team, I believe, starting with HHS. Thanks, Frank.
No, thank you very much. And that was very informative, and it's critical that we keep moving forward on those legislative issues. So what we'll be hearing about now is how we implement and manage what's available to us today. But everything you heard about would be very helpful to us moving forward. So I'm Frank Desmarais with the Department of Housing and Community Affairs. We have two critical components to this segment. One is to share with you from Department of Health and Human Services. Ilana Brand is with us to speak to the current available rental assistance, which is substantial and available for application today. And then we'll speak to the protections and the support for tenants that are facing other challenges with court actions, eviction preparation, and the range of services that Department of Housing and other parts of the county support you with. And I know we have a lot of questions in the chat and the Q&A, but we really do need to help you understand the support and the process for applying for and hopefully receiving rental assistance. So Ilana.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. As Frank mentioned, I'm Ilana Branda. I'm the Deputy Chief with Services to End and Prevent Homelessness within HHS, and we manage the Housing Stabilization Services and the COVID Rent Relief Program. So as many of you may have already heard, we did open our round 3 of the program. Applications open. We started accepting applications on April 14th. For this round 3 of the program. And thank you, Matt. He just put the link in the chat. If you have not gone to the website yet, we have a lot of FAQs there. We have flyers in different languages. There's information for landlords and everything. And so our round 3, as mentioned by a number of our delegates, it is funded through federal funds. It's a mixture of direct assistance that the county received and passed through funds from the state. So we have about $59 million in total at the moment. That is from the December federal relief package. Treasury has not yet released the most recent rent relief fund. So we do know that there's additional funds that will be coming. So key things for everybody here. Again, we started accepting applications April 14th. We are beginning to process those applications. We have 3 prioritization criteria that we are using in terms of the order and how we are processing applications. If members of the household have been unemployed for at least 90 days or more, if the household lives in a priority area, so on the website, there is a link to the map that we are using of those high need priority area, and if there's an active eviction action currently occurring. So we will be prioritizing those applications. We have increased our staff substantially since round 2, so we hope that will make it be able to allow us to expedite the applications more, but there is still a tremendous amount of program demand. So we know this is a very personally challenging time for anyone who is applying for the program or considering applying for the program. But to the extent possible, we thank you in advance for your patience as we try to get through the cases as quickly as we can. In terms of core eligibility, you do need to have been a Montgomery County resident since at least August of 2020. Your household income from either the previous 30 days or from your 2020 taxes, if you've already prepared those, must be below 50% of the area median income. The chart of all of that is on the website also. You have to have had a COVID-related loss of income in the household. I want to clarify that can be that you needed to stay home to care for yourself or others, whether that was a minor child or someone personally experiencing COVID. If you unfortunately experienced the death of a wage earner in your household due to COVID, or your employment was closed or reduced hours, but it has to be a COVID loss of income. And you have to be behind at least $1,000 with your rent, irrespective of how much you owe. But after your rent was due, you have to be at least $1,000 behind. We did completely revamp the application portal. We got a lot of feedback from our previous rounds of how that works. So again, we're trying to make sure that we can expedite to the extent possible. So if you have not yet applied, you want to first go to the website, click on Start a New Application. It will walk you through the pre-eligibility screening and then invite you to set up an account and complete a full application. There is also document checklist. You will need documentation to demonstrate proof of residency, income for all members of the household over 18, photo ID for adult members of the household, and your rental information. If you, so ask your property for your rent ledger. If you are not in a formal lease, you just want something in writing. So please make sure to try to have those documents with you beforehand so that you can go in and upload those into the application at the same time. If perhaps your landlord completed an application thinking that you may be eligible and submitted your information, in that case, you may receive an email from MoCo Housing Assistance that invites you to go in and complete an application. It will include a confirmation number. You want to do the same thing I just mentioned, start a new application, go through everything, and when prompted, put in that confirmation number, and that will help us link and match the applications so we can expedite them quicker. If you have, everyone who's on here probably has internet, but if you are calling in or if you have any other challenge that prevents you from completing the application on your own, you are welcome to call 311. 311 will take down your information and we will have a member of the program team call you back to help you complete that application. If you're in the application itself, at the top of every screen, there's a Get Help button. On the very first, if you click Just Start a New Application screen, there's a Need to Reach Us. And we are responding to those emails as quickly as possible also, and to trying to address any quick questions people may have about the program. Other things I didn't mention, it's up to $12,000 per household. It is very specific for the months you owe arrears. So please, do try to put all that information in fully. The checks or the payment is generally made to the landlord on your behalf. You will receive a confirmation email or letter when that payment goes out, in addition to the landlord receiving that letter. And as it came up before about holding the landlords accountable, there are commitments that the landlord is expected to make with receipt of these funds. They are required to waive all legal fees, late fees, and penalties that may have been occurred during this assistance period. They are required to cancel any active eviction proceedings, and they are not allowed to begin any new eviction proceedings for at least 30 days after the benefit period ends. So if we pay your rent through, let's say, April, they would not be able to start or file for any proceedings until at least May 30th. And if you have a lease that is expiring or has expired, they are required to offer you a 90-day renewal with that. I do want to caveat, though, as mentioned before by the Attorney General, with a number of the moratoriums, a lot of these things are openings for affirmative defenses, and that's what this kind of is too. So we are not able to, we don't have an enforcement mechanism within HHS to ensure that your landlord has done all of that, but it is an affirmative defense for you if they do try to file an eviction too early, or if they try to file an eviction and include late fees that they were required to waive. These are defenses that you can take, and you would have that documentation with you to take to court. So with that, I will pause because I know it's late and there's a lot of information we've all been gathering already this evening, and turn it back to Frank, and I'll check if there's anything I missed in the chat or Q&A at the same time.
Frank, if I may jump in real quick.
Please go ahead.
A question or two. Ilana, maybe you mentioned this, but if you could re-emphasize it if you did, and say it if you didn't. The people who are on the waiting list, what do they need to do to if they didn't hear back, what is the relationship of the previous program waiting list to the current program?
Sure, thanks. So for those that were on the wait list, you may know that you really primarily gave us contact information to be notified when there may be additional funding available. So now there is additional funding available, but we do need a complete and full application for anyone to be considered for this assistance. There's a lot of reporting requirements and guidance that we have to follow from the Treasury, and so we do need that full application for that. So everyone who is on the wait list, we have sent an email or we have called you if you did not provide an email address, but you do not need to wait for us. We were doing that as a notification to let you know to please come in and complete an application. So if you have not yet completed an application and you want to be considered, please go in and complete that application. Again, we do have to follow the prioritization criteria. Unfortunately, just because you are on the wait list, it does not necessarily mean that you will be the first application considered, but we do need a full application. If you need assistance with completing that application, again, you can call 311 and we will provide you with that assistance. Matt, was there another question? Or?
I can add one if Frank's not ready.
No, I just thought you had said before that you had a couple. So
one with the $12,000 deal. Can you also remind folks that if you received $3,000 before, you're still eligible to get $9,000 in the $12,000 program?
Yes, that is a very important distinction. If you did receive funding from round 1 or round 2, or if you may have received funding from the state assisted housing program, or city of Gaithersburg, city of Tacoma Park, any other COVID related rental assistance, you are still eligible to apply, but it is a $12,000 household cap for COVID related rental relief. So whatever you have received from the other programs, we will take that into account for any assistance that we are able to provide now. And you reminded me, Matt, the other thing that I want to draw out is in previous rounds, if you were receiving a housing choice voucher, you were not eligible for the program. You were asked to go and coordinate that with your housing subsidy program. You are eligible to apply now for the amount that you are responsible for in your rent for any arrears. I do say, though, that if you are in that boat, please do submit a new income redetermination with the provider of your subsidy so that moving forward, you are able to maintain your rent payments.
All right, if that's it for the questions, we can continue to take them in the chat, and we'll try and make sure we catch up as best we can, time allowing. So from the fundamentals of what Alana just covered, application, getting your application is critical. There's no cutoff date. This is a program that's going to be available till funds are exhausted, and the current level of funding of 59 million that came through the federal stimulus first round and will be augmented, increased by federal stimulus coming from the American Rescue Plan. So this is very important to get applications in and going. And to help you with that, the county does have support information available at the website, the DHCA website, the DHHS website. Information about that is available online. There's a page that has a list of support organizations that are working with the county, including Renters Alliance. And it's the main Montgomery County website, montgomerycountymd.gov/renters. It has the contact information for Renters Alliance, Housing Initiative Partnership, CASA, and LEDC. It also has information about the Maryland Legal Aid, the Homeless Persons Representation Project. The legal assistance that's available there is for anyone who has a court date. Anyone that receives a notice of a court summons should be contacting legal assistance. There's legal representation available at the court for failure to pay rent cases and the other cases, but predominantly we're seeing the majority of cases failure to pay rent. So there's a very large number of backlog cases and new cases coming through. We're now going to talk about the support that's available and the key protections that are available to you. Rosie McCray Moody, the manager of our Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs, will review the information and then the support that her office provides and other. And it's very important to know this information is available, but the people that can help you understand it are also available. So if Rosie, if you can highlight the key things for anyone that's currently facing any eviction action or any kind of difficulty with their landlord during the COVID period. And then we'll do questions after that.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I know it's getting late. Evictions. You cannot be evicted unless you are taken to court, a judgment is issued, and a warrant of restitution is issued, and the sheriff comes out. So if all those things haven't happened, you cannot be evicted. So if you get a letter that says if you don't pay by such and such a date, we're going to change the locks and put you out, your landlord is lying, call Landlord Tenant Affairs and we will help you, because they cannot do that. You can only be evicted through court process. You can be, although there's a moratorium, if you get a notice for tenant holding over or breach of lease, you can still get evicted now. So be careful. If you're at the end of your lease and they gave you a notice that says we're not going to renew, and they gave you a date to leave, if you don't leave, they can take you to court and they can get a judgment against you. And honestly, because there's no cause, there's really no defense. So you can't be evicted unless you can prove that even though they gave you a tenant holding over notice, they're really doing this because you're behind in your rent. Legal aid is in the court every day. So get there early. If you get a notice to go to court, please, 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 it's imperative that you go to court, because most of the people who get judgments are the people who didn't show up. Legal aid is there and they've been able to help a lot of people because they were there. If you're not there, they can't help you. They can't stand in for you. So please go to court. If you are the county council passed legislation that a landlord cannot increase rents more than the voluntary guideline. Right now, that's 1.4%. If you get a rent increase higher than 1.4%, or the landlord tries to charge you a month-to-month fee, call the Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs. Those are not legal right now.
Rosie, can you tell them when these take effect?
When what takes place?
The 1.4 was February 5th.
February 5th. Any
And prior
notice
to
you
that-
got after February 5th cannot exceed 1.4%. If you got your notice prior to February 5th, it cannot exceed 2.6%. And the month-to-month fee doesn't go regardless because it's going to exceed the guidelines. So report that you should file. We're going to ask you to file a complaint.
I would also ask that you let us know. One of the things that landlord tenant will handle your complaint, but we as the Renters Alliance would like to know, because very often if it's happening to you in your apartment complex, it's happening to your neighbors as well. And so sometimes we like to alert landlord tenant and elected officials and others about a wider problem than an individual complaint.
And if you file a complaint, we usually do ask the landlord to show us all the notices that he sent out from a certain date going forward, just to verify that this isn't a one-time deal. Because usually if you got one, somebody else got one too. What else did I want to tell you? I want to tell you to go to court and that somebody's on duty every day from, I think it's 8:30 to 5. So somebody's there. If you call 311, we will call you back. We usually call you back the same day, or we'll leave you a message and somebody call you back the next day, but we will call you back. We have one of the best records for return calls in the county. So please call 311. We will get back to you.
Rosie, would you also explain 3 things? What is an affirmative defense? We heard that used, but it's a legal term. But what does it really mean? 1, and 2, what does the governor's order do, and what does the CDC order do, and how can tenants take advantage of both?
Okay, the governor's order says if you've lost your job or you've lost income because of COVID, then you can go to court and say, I haven't been able to keep up with my rent because I lost my job due to COVID. But you can use that as, that's an affirmative defense. However, you need to bring some documentation with you. You can't just waltz in there and say, well, I haven't been paying because I lost my job due to COVID. And you don't have a letter or a bank statement or something to show that your funds have dropped. You have to be able to verify that. The CDC order says nobody can be evicted for failure to pay rent prior to June the 30th. If they have filled out that CDC declaration, which is on our website, and presented it to the landlord. So it's not an automatic. You have to do your part, because if you don't do your part, when you go to court, you have nothing. So if you have your CDC declaration that shows that you gave it to the landlord, and apply, there's money out there. You know, Alana has said you have up to $12,000. Apply for everything that you may be eligible for. Print it off that you applied for it and take that to court to show you are trying, because you will have to pay this debt one way or the other. You are going to have to pay this debt. So do everything you can to show that you're trying to pay it, and that will help keep you housed.
And Rosie, the CDC order and the declaration, maybe Frank or you can explain how that works.
The declaration is just a piece of paper saying that you swear that you lost funds due to COVID, some COVID related incident, and you give that to the landlord that shows that, you know, this is what's going on. And if you take that to court, that's an affirmative defense for why you haven't kept up with your rent. And that will stay them evicting you at least until June the 30th.
Frank, are there any other steps that go with that?
Well, number one, getting access to that document. It can be searched easily. Any search engine you put in CDC declaration, you'll find it. You'll also find it at the Montgomery County website. If you go there and put in CDC declaration, I'll be pasting the link into the chat here in a moment. So it's critical to use the form. It must be signed by all tenants on the lease and must be presented physically by mail with certified receipt or some evidence the landlord's received it. It also can be presented on the day of your court hearing. So showing up in court, even if you have not presented that declaration to your landlord, but if you believe you qualify on the conditions that Rosie just mentioned, you've lost income, it's also your income's not above $99,000 a year, and that you've attempted to receive assistance and you've attempted to make payments. If you make that declaration, you can sign it in court, and there'll be copies of the declaration available to you. Legal representation in court will present with you that to the court. And if you get a judge that accepts that, and you will get a stay of the eviction order, the judgment against you, until the CDC order expires June 30. So it buys you time to be working with the rental assistance, to be working with your landlord. And it's critical because it will be accepted by the judge, but you have to show up in court. Even if you've given it to your landlord, you still have to go to court and tell the court that you gave it to the landlord and show some evidence that you did it.
We have 3 minutes. Does anybody have a serious question for either of our panelists? I have put the CDC declaration link in the chat. If anybody has any questions that were not answered or concerns that need to be addressed, obviously you can call 311 and contact HHS directly, or the Department of Housing and Community Affairs through 311 directly. And as Frank Desmarais points out, the website is also in the chat, and you can go there and find information that you need. But please contact the Renters Alliance if you need our assistance. We're at info@rentersalliance.org. We are, again, the first and only organization in this region dedicated exclusively to renter outreach, education, organizing, and advocacy. We've been doing this for a while. And we know some of the ins and outs and how to get you assistance formally and informally. So let us know how we can help. If there's nothing else, Frank, any last words?
Well, this is way too much information for a short call like this. The critical thing is to follow up. The county's website for the rental assistance has all of the terms, conditions, eligibility. The other thing is, I want to mention that the support you can look to is also from your landlord. Your landlord will get paid back rent when you follow through with the rental assistance. They have a role in completing their part of it, but they can also support you and help you with that process. So look to the county, to the support organizations like Renters Alliance, to your landlord, and to work with that process to hopefully work with the landlord to avoid him having or them having to take you to court. But that's the critical thing, is to bring those two pieces together, which is the landlord getting paid, avoiding the eviction through the rental assistance.
All right, thank you, Frank Desmarais, Deputy Director of the Department of Housing and Community Affairs. Alana Branda, always on top of the Renter Assistance Program for HHS, giving critical information and rocking and rolling through now the third program of rental assistance. We thank her for that and her team. Rosie McCray Moody, as always, from the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs. And a special thanks to my board of directors, to William Roberts, our chair, Sophia Bushin, Chris Perry, our vice chair, Janelle Wilkins, and Justin Chappell, and Vaughn Stewart, and Brandy Brooks. I want to point out about our elected officials who are on our board. They were on our board before they were elected officials. We like to say we're the farm team for the leadership of the state of Maryland, but they were dedicated to these issues well before they represented the tenants who are now relying so heavily on their leadership. So I want to thank our board for their dedication and commitment to this critical issue that so many of us face, that's central to community prosperity, health, and welfare. So with that, thank you to all of you, and good night.
Good night.